If you have a question, just raise your hand, because, and I guarantee if you have a question, you're not the only one in the room. So you'll be doing all of us a favor by asking your question. Brittany, I think we could go ahead and, have you started recording? Oh, okay. You did take a break between. So these were my answers to the first one. Difference between calcium channels that are open during pacemaker depolarizations and the ones that are open during upstroke in pacemaker cells. So what is this getting at? It's getting at the difference between these calcium channels and these calcium channels. There's no real difference. Your book talks about T-type calcium channels, which are different, but they aren't the only thing that's important for the pacemaker. So there are similarities, and the similarities outweigh the differences. Questions? Why do pacemaker cells slowly depolarize and contractile cells in the atria and ventricular myocardium don't? Yes.
How do we know age? Because I thought that for both of them, they have a bunch of resting K channels, and that's why the membrane potential is very negative.
Ah, is it very negative in pacemaker cells?
Oh, not so much. Yeah, okay.
So, not so much.
Okay,
It
so
is not very negative because we have relatively few of the resting potassium channels in pacemaker cells, and we have lots of resting potassium channels in myocardium and contractiles.
makes sense. Thank you.
Question? Yeah, so
What's like the reasoning for are there no IH channels in the contractile ones?
yeah, contractile cells simply do not express IH channels.
And
I didn't teach you that, but now you know.
And for C, it's just like because it's more negative. there's
D,
more.
D as in David,
C,
C as in Charlie.
yeah.
Pacemaker cells have more voltage-gated potassium channels than contractile cells. No, contractile cells
Up more.
have a lot because of the rapid repolarization.
Okay.
I mean, in order to have the rapid repolarization. So yeah, some of these things I taught you and we knew, and some of these things we had to guess and figure out, but now we're going through them. That's why we're doing it this way. Other questions? Upstroke in pacemaker cells slower than that of contractile cells. That's true. I mean, what we're getting at here is upstroke in pacemaker cells slower than upstroke in contractile cells. Calcium channels versus sodium channels. Sodium channels are fast, calcium channels are slow. Plateau of the action potential in contractile cells. I'm using a word here that I might not have used before. This is the plateau. Why? What causes it? I told you about calcium channels, but I didn't tell you that there's also potassium channels, and so there's calcium influx and potassium efflux going on at the same time during the plateau. And that balancing act keeps the membrane potential at around 0 millivolts. Calcium, acting by itself, would cause the membrane potential to go up higher. Potassium by itself would cause the membrane potential to go back negative. But during the plateau, there is sort of this equivalence of calcium influx and potassium influx holding the membrane potential in between too high and too low. It's like a Goldilocks situation. Yes, TJ?
So are the resting potassium channels, do they stay closed until it repolarizes?
Okay, so the resting potassium channels are blocked by intracellular magnesium until it's repolarized. On your quiz, I accepted, because I didn't teach that, and I'm not sure your book clarifies that very well, I accepted pretty much any answer for the resting potassium channels, except for at rest, when you had to say they were open. But now you know that the resting potassium channels are open at rest. They're open at negative voltages, and they are blocked by intracellular magnesium by the rest of it. And block is equivalent to being closed. But it's not exactly the same. Closed, no, I don't want to get into it. They are not permeable if they are blocked. What ends the plateau phase? So now we're talking about the repolarization. Questions? What causes the delay between atrial contraction or systole and ventricular systole? Questions?
Why wouldn't we see?
C as in Charlie. The pacemaker depolarization of ventricles. Well, I mean, this is a kind of a tricky, this is a terrible answer because there's so many untruths to it. The ventricles are not in the AV node. I mean, the AV node is not in the ventricles. It's in the inferior aspect of the right atrium. So that's weird. There is no pacemaker depolarization of ventricles. Pacemaker ventricles. If I think about the ventricles, I think about this, and there is no pacemaker depolarization of these. These cells are depolarized by their neighbors, and those are eventually depolarized by their neighbors. Eventually, it's all driven by the SA node. Okay. Is this the last one? Oh, no.
Previous question. Will it be D also an answer?
D as in David?
Yeah.
They have Purkinje fibers, and that has no effect on depolarization. Well, it speeds, it increases the speed. It does not slow ventricular depolarization. The Purkinje fibers are like a network of fast fibers that accelerate the spread of depolarization throughout the ventricles, not slow. So D is definitely a false statement. What is the mechanism for slow propagation through the AV node compared to atrial and ventricular myocardium? That is, why is it slow in the AV node and fast in atrial and ventricular myocardium? AV node uses calcium channels for their action potentials, and they're intrinsically slow compared to sodium channels, and a few gap junctions. Yes, Robert?
Why is it not C?
C as in Charlie, okay. AV node is insulated, so this is a true statement. And this is part of why the AV node is, so it's a true statement. It's part of why the AV node is the window for excitation to spread from the atria into the ventricles. But it doesn't answer the question as to why the AV node spreads slower than the myocardium. So this is a kind of a trick answer. It's a true statement, but it doesn't answer the question.
Like, what is your exam? Are we supposed to know that those are slower? Like, what's faster and what's slower? I don't know. We haven't really gotten into it before. Like, yes, the number of channels, but not like how fast they actually.
Yeah, so let me just use the language to make sure that we're speaking the same language. Let me just say that, and I think I used this language in the problem set, or maybe in the quiz. This is super slow. This is a ultra slow depolarization. This is a upstroke, so it's faster than this, but it is slower than this.
Okay. Okay, makes sense.
So this is ultra slow. This is slow. This is very fast. And it's because the difference here to here is the difference in the kinetics and the number of voltage-gated calcium channels here and voltage-gated sodium channels here. Okay, so let's move on. Oh, one more thing. Sorry, I'm just scrolling around like this. This is the slide about the AV node. The AV node, its job is to be to enforce the delay and to slow conduction from the atria to the ventricles. But you may have noticed, wait a second, the AV node can spontaneously reach threshold, and it can spontaneously fire an action potential. And so the AV node is our first backup pacemaker. If the SA node fails, and it happens, there's disease of the SA node, we have a backup pacemaker in the AV node. But normally, the SA node depolarizes and reaches threshold faster than the AV node. And so normally the AV node is driven by its neighbors the same way the atria and the ventricular myocytes are driven by their neighbors. But if the AV node is not driven by a neighbor, it can act as a pacemaker. You can see ventricular myocardium would basically never normally act as a pacemaker. Okay? Yes?
How would it spread to the atrium? If there's
It
like
wouldn't.
divided? Oh.
If the AV node is acting as a pacemaker, then it's going to be, we're talking about abnormality. It would be spreading into the atria at the same time it's spreading into the ventricles, and atrial contraction wouldn't matter at all. But we can survive without atrial contraction, as we'll get to in a few minutes. Okay. Now what I want to do is change gears and talk about how the heart rate, we're not talking about the strength yet, we're talking about the rate of the heart and how it is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Now you know that this is true. When you're stressed, your heart beats faster. When you're relaxed, your heart beats slower. Why? What are the molecular mechanisms? That's what I'm getting to. So here's a cartoon of a pacemaker cell. Slow depolarization reaches threshold, fires an action potential by the mechanisms you now know about. So I'm talking generically first, and then we'll get into the nervous system activation. So there are three generic ways to change the pace. After all, if we shorten the interval between action potentials, if we shorten the period, we increase the frequency, which we call, the heart rate. It's not really a rate. Physicists probably go crazy calling it a rate. It's a heart frequency, but we call it a heart rate. Okay, so one mechanism is if we make the slow depolarization faster, it will reach threshold faster. How could we make the slow depolarization faster? We could make more IH channel activity. We could close the potassium channels faster. Or we could we could activate the calcium channels more and faster, right? More IH, faster. Faster closing of the K channels, faster. More calcium channels would contribute to the depolarization more, and that would make it faster. So we have mechanisms to increase the rate, but after all, we also decrease the rate. All we have to do to decrease the rate is slow the pacemaker depolarization, and the red indicates the mechanisms for slowing the pacemaker depolarization. So this slide embeds both how you could speed the pacemaker depolarization in green and how you could slow the pacemaker depolarization in red. If I put both of these on the slide, it gets too busy, so I'm just showing the increase. Questions about this first general mechanism? How we speed the slow, ultra-slow pacemaker depolarization.
So you could increase or decrease either of those.
You could do any of them or any combination of them.
So that would make the slow depolarization a little bit faster or a little bit slower.
Oh, I see. If you're saying if we increase this and we decrease this, we don't do that. It doesn't happen.
But we're changing the slow depolarization.
Yes, that's what we're talking about.
So that can increase or decrease.
Yes, the slow depolarization can increase and our heart rate gets faster, and the slow depolarization can decrease and our heart rate gets slower. You obviously don't do that at the same time. When you're stressed, you do the green. And when you're relaxed, you do the red. Patricia?
So, when we want to make it faster, we increase the K channels closing. That's
By making them close faster, we decrease potassium efflux faster. Okay, so generic mechanism one, change, either increase or decrease the slow depolarization between beats. Generic mechanism two, make the membrane potential that it goes to between beats, the maximum polarization, more or less negative. How does this work? Well, if we make the maximum polarization less negative, it's closer to threshold. And the same rate would bring it to threshold faster. So we're not changing. You may notice that this slope and this slope are the same slope, but we're at a less negative starting point. Brittany, are we still recording okay? So how could we change the starting point? Well, if we make fewer resting potassium channels, remember resting potassium channels tend to bring the membrane potential negative by potassium flowing out, leaving behind negative charges. More potassium channels, more negative. Less potassium channels, less negative. So fewer resting potassium channels makes this potential less negative. And remember that voltage-gated potassium channels were responsible for this. So fewer, or making them close faster, would bring the membrane potential down to a less negative voltage. Basically changing, well, decreasing the activity of potassium channels, both resting and voltage-gated, would make the less potassium efflux less negative starting point. Increasing would make the membrane potential more negative and slow the heart rate, because you'd be starting from a more negative potential and it would take longer to get to threshold. Questions about this? Okay, so mechanism 2, generic mechanism 2, and now the generic mechanism 3 is to change threshold. So you should notice here in generic mechanism 3, the slope is not changed, the starting point is not changed. It's just that when the action potential is triggered, the threshold is made more negative. In this case, if the threshold is made more negative, it will reach it faster and the rate increases. If the threshold was raised, it would take longer to get to it and it would be slower. What controls threshold? Calcium channels. If we increase the activation of calcium channels, it's equivalent to making threshold more negative. And if we decrease the activity of calcium channels, it causes threshold to be less negative or positive. So those are the, Sophie?
So how does that change the threshold?
Remember, so the threshold in a pacemaker cell is determined by when we go from just a few calcium channels open to when we have a lot of calcium channels open. And if we make it easier to go from few to a lot, we lower the threshold because the channels are voltage gated. So the voltage at which we can transition from few to a lot is less depolarized. So now let's put these three generic mechanisms into play and understand the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems, what you experience when you're stressed and when you're relaxed. So here is a cartoon of actual data. Here's a heart rate. Boom, 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 once every second. During stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, it goes from boom, boom, boom. Now it's going boom, 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 increasing the rate. Do we see the mechanisms? Well, here you can see increasing the rate of the pacemaker depolarization. Right? Faster here than here. A tiny bit, by the time we get a tiny bit less negative here than here. A tiny bit doesn't really show up very clearly, but it happens. And threshold has been moved, well, threshold has not been affected much in this cartoon, but it is affected. In any case, what you're seeing is a cartoon of actual data showing that when you stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, you accelerate the heart rate. You know that. What are the mechanisms? So I'll do this, and then one more slide, and then we'll take a break. An actual break. What are the mechanisms? The sympathetic nervous system releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine activate beta-1 adrenergic receptors throughout the heart. So I do want, this is a detail I want you to know. The beta-1 receptors are coupled to GS. The GS story, PKA story, you know this, I'm not going to tell it again. In this setting, PKA activates IH and calcium channels. So activating IH increases the pacemaker depolarization. Activating calcium channels lowers threshold and increases the pacemaker depolarization. Both of those are mechanisms for accelerating the heart rate. So when you're nervous or stressed or working out, physical stress, your sympathetic nervous system, norepinephrine and epinephrine, GS, beta-1 receptors, GS story, IH and calcium channels. Activation.
What would happen if we have high cortisol? So it's not like a
High cortisol. High cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, but it doesn't, by itself, it does not trigger changes in the heart. So cortisol is important for changing the responses in skeletal muscle, in the brain, in the liver. So cortisol is a stress hormone, like epinephrine and norepinephrine, but its effects on the heart are subtle, and so I'm not going to get into it. It's the sympathetic nervous system, and not the endocrinology of stress that changes heart function. Okay, let's do one more, and then we'll take a break. You know that when you're relaxed and lying in your bed watching YouTube videos, whatever, your heart rate goes down. Here is an example of it from data. Boom, 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 boom. Artificial stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the parasympathetic nervous system being activated. The neurotransmitter here is acetylcholine. The receptors for acetylcholine in this case are not the receptors at the neuromuscular junction, but are muscarinic receptors. That's a name I want you to know. Why muscarinic? It's a pharmacology name. Muscarine is a drug that's found in mushrooms. It's actually a toxin that's found in mushrooms, and it causes poisonous mushrooms have toxic levels of muscarine and cause death by activation of muscarinic receptors. Well, we don't die when we activate our muscarinic receptors by the amount of acetylcholine that we normally do. Okay? But the name comes from a toxin.
Is that what makes a lot of mushrooms hallucinogenic?
Hallucinogenic mushroom, the mechanisms for hallucination is different from this. So you don't hallucinate with a psychedelic mushroom because it's changing your heart. It's activating, it's really serotonin receptors in the brain. So it's a different story altogether. Different drug, different story. Anyway, muscarinic receptors are coupled to GI. At least these it's gonna get complicated. These muscarinic receptors are coupled to GI. So GI turns off everything that GS did. And we have a decrease in IH activity, slowing the heart rate. A decrease in calcium channel, slowing the rate and raising threshold, slowing the heart rate. And activation of potassium channels, making the membrane potential, look at how the sort of the maximum membrane potential went more negative because of activation of resting and voltage-gated potassium channels. And then it wears off.
What did the resting they lower
Why is it lower here than here? More voltage-gated potassium channels and more resting potassium channels. More potassium channels, both voltage-gated and resting. Okay, so I've been talking for an hour. Let's take an honest-to-goodness break for 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back and talk about the electrocardiogram. Okay? I don't have any clicker questions at this point. I don't think I've given you enough information to answer a problem set question yet. So let's just take a real break.